to talk about Paradise Lost, and we're going to sort of engage it from various angles, but let me just start by introducing myself. I'm Pearce Durst, and I'm in my second year at Urbana Seminary as an associate professor of Christianity and culture. I'll give you some background about my education and kind of help inform my perspective on this poem. I have my BA in literature from the University of Illinois, an MA also in English literature from a school in Virginia, Old Dominion University. And then I went on to get my PhD in rhetoric and composition from Washington State University before coming back full circle and graduating from Urbana Seminary in 2022 with a MAR from Urbana Seminary. So I've taught several various courses from lots of different disciplines in the liberal arts, including global literature. I've taught classic rhetoric, multimodal composition, and various courses in film, introductory, advanced, and classes on certain film directors. I actually have an upcoming class this spring at the seminary called Jesus at the Movies. And while this sort of lecture is not really about a film, it's very Miltonian, I will start with a film reference, a connection, if you will. In a recent BBC interview, the director of the movie Barbie, Greta Gerwig, was talking about how Renaissance poetry influenced her films, and especially Barbie. She said in this interview, and I quote, "I remember the first time when I read Milton, and I realized this idea that paradise has no poetry. Because what do you need metaphor for if everything is literally what it is? You need this sort of separation from your environment in order to have a need for the beauty of poetry." That Greta Gerwig is thinking about Milton's radical retelling of the book of Genesis may not be all that surprising. In another interview for Vogue, for instance, Gerwig calls Barbie dolls the opposite of the creation myth in Genesis, in the sense that Eve was created after Adam, but in Barbie, Ken is made for Barbie. That's the opposite. So surely Gerwig is not the first to do a modern retelling of the book of Genesis. Hers is just the most popular and most recent in the public imagination. Long ago, 357 years ago to be precise, in 1667, John Milton penned Paradise Lost, his retelling of the book of Genesis, if you will. In it, he challenges assumptions of his contemporaries, Christian commentators, and, in general, readers' assumptions about living in a state of innocence. For instance, Milton does not understand Adam and Eve tending to the garden to keep them from idleness, but it is out of necessity. The garden, he says, will revert to wildness unless Adam and Eve continually prune the burgeoning vegetation. He does not conceive of the ideal state as static, but associates it with challenge, choice, and growth. His theological outlook allowed him to escape a biblical literalism common to his fellow Puritans because he gave the indwelling Spirit of God priority over the letter of Scripture. At one point, for instance, he has the archangel, as he understands him, Raphael, refuse to validate a literal reading of the six-day creation. Adam dialogues with God about a mate, and he records a dispute, a marital dispute between Adam and Eve, all extra-biblical. Since its publication, Paradise Lost has continually impacted art and culture. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, took the epigraph for her book from Milton. This is the first quote on the handout I have in front of you. "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" If that's not enough, the monster in Frankenstein is seen reading Paradise Lost at one point in the novel. Virginia Woolf called Paradise Lost the essence of which almost all other poetry is mere dilution. Modern poet Richard Wilbur calls Milton the greatest verse architect in history. And it's not just highbrow authors and poets and writers, but it's also in a lot of more common cultural spaces, such as video games. The 1993 game Doom, which has been reinvented many, many times, has a level that the player travels to combat a demon invasion in a level called Pandemonium. The word pandemonium was John Milton's coinage, combining the word pan, all, daemon, demons, or spirits in Latin, all spirits, all demons. And it appears in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, where he says, this is a quote 2 on your handout, "A solemn council forthwith to be held at Pandemonium, the high capital of Satan and his peers." This is the capital of hell. The city was built, Milton describes, in 1 hour by the fallen angels by an architect who seems to be the Roman god Vulcan, who previously designed the palaces of heaven in pure gold. But now he is making a habitation in hell, an enclosure without light, but has more beautiful architecture than man can make. Now, I know you're thinking that the game designers of Doom have no idea about Milton coining the word pandemonium. And that's probably likely, but many of us don't know the around 630 words that we use in the English language that Milton coined. He coined more words in the English language than any other author known, including William Shakespeare. These include words like unoriginal. The word unoriginal was once original. Self-esteem, earth-shaking, fragrance, enjoyable. Those are all Milton's words. And as a lot of them are combining, a prefix or a suffix, like enjoyable, right, or to joy, and so forth. But there's around 630 estimated words that he has coined. And maybe, video games aren't your cup of tea, but there are also musicians, and there are more than a few that have referenced Paradise Lost. The most contemporary and most well-known that I could find was rapper Eminem, who in a video provocatively titled Rap God, has lyrics, or rather verses from Paradise Lost interspersed between his own lyrics and images from the books of Paradise Lost in the video, just to make a statement. There are countless other musicians, there's theatrical adaptations, there's radio performances, there's TV shows like Star Trek, for example, that reference Paradise Lost. For instance, one episode from 1967 called Space Seed has a character named Khan who is basically removed to another planet away from Captain Kirk's society. And he says at one point that he would rather rule there than accommodate Captain Kirk's own society, that he'd rather be on this primitive planet. This is a reference to Paradise Lost for those who don't know it. We'll get to it. But there's tons of references in art and literature, direct explicit acknowledgments from authors like John Steinbeck, Neil Gaiman, Salman Rushdie, and many others who acknowledge the influence that John Milton has had on their own thinking and writing. And this includes more than just pop culture and the world of mass consumed media, but also scholars, intellectuals, and thinkers alike come to John Milton for various reasons. For instance, J.R.R. Tolkien once observed in a letter that the loss of paradise is the central plot of literature. C.S. Lewis once delivered a series of lectures in 1941 that's now collected in a book called A Preface to Paradise Lost that has basically shaped all of Milton's studies in the second half of the 20th century. Stanley Fish is a scholar who is, by training, a Milton scholar, whose work Surprised by Sin, which is a reference to C.S. Lewis, updates Lewis's insights and argues brilliantly that Milton and his strategy throughout Paradise Lost was to impress upon readers his or her own fallenness. The literary scholar Marjorie Nicholson once suggested that if Shakespeare was the poet of time, then Milton is the poet of space. Diane Kelsey Macaulay presents Milton's Eve character as one that can withstand the greatest feminist critic, and she's not alone. This whole presentation could be one on Eve and whether she fights oppressive patriarchy or whether she falls in line with that. That's a hotly debated topic. Barbara Lewowski, who is a scholar of note, she has a Blackwell edition of Paradise Lost that is nicely annotated. She's written on Milton in his biography. Her work is impressive. She calls John Milton an apologist of freedom. She says, to quote, that his work was part of a strenuous project of educating readers in the virtues, values, and attitudes that made a people worthy of liberty. The point I'm trying to illustrate is that Paradise Lost remains a cultural and intellectual touchstone still today. But what is it about this 357-year-old epic poem that is a rewriting and extension of the book of Genesis that sustains its relevance? That's sort of my dominant research question. To answer this question, it's best first to address Paradise Lost as a poem. Milton composed this epic poem in rushing and jammed blank verse. I'll define all that in a moment. But he propels us forward with few pauses between lines or sections. He writes in an elevated diction and provides very complex sentence structure or syntax, and sometimes sound patterns that sound magnificently musical. He finds form to fit the content of this epic. He's writing a narrative epic poem. He's not writing beautiful lyric poetry, though at times it is very beautiful. He is not writing a tragedy, but he is following the epic tradition. And the epic tradition had certain established conventions. Some of those are an invocation. We'll look at the invocation for this poem and talk about that. He begins, like other epics, in media res, in the middle of things. He uses an epic hero, which is likely the figure of Satan. We'll debate that. He uses a Homeric catalog. For instance, he provides a catalog of Satan's generals in an epic style. And he draws from mythology, literature, philosophy, politics in order to create these catalogs, among other discourse areas. He provides a fierce battle in heaven, as it were. He provides a set of characters with supernatural powers, primarily God, the Son, and angels. These are all conventions of the epic tradition. Epic poetry has a very long tradition, and I'm going to try to summarize what are the major movements you'll notice if you look at this up to the time of Milton. At first, someone like Homer might show a lot of action in the world, things that are happening out there. But by the modern era, let's say Milton's time, 16th century or so, we start to see a lot of psychological reflections where the poet enters the narrative and talks about what's happening as they see it. Milton's somewhere in the middle of these two, and that's why it's important, I think, to engage his biography, which I'll do more of that as we go along. But considering the ancient subject matter that has been told and retold, the poetic form that Milton uses allows for one particular effect, and that is what critics call defamiliarization. And poetry is very good at defamiliarization, which is an artistic technique of presenting audiences with common things in an uncommon or strange light so that they can see that common thing from a new perspective, from a fresh angle. Poetry is uniquely capable at doing that, of presenting common things in an uncommon light. It's sort of like spring cleaning when you open the curtains and the light falls on a corner that you haven't seen for a whole year. It raises old things out of their dusty corners, and it allows us to experience a lot of things in this poem, such as the fall, maybe for the very first time. Defamiliarization also explains why there is an increase of difficulty when reading poetry, and this poem is definitely no exception. It is very difficult, even for the most experienced poetry readers. However, it is rewarding to read if we see the process as intentionally trying to get us to see things not as they are known, but as they really are. He wants us to see things as they're seen, not as they're known. to get rid of our preconceptions, to look at them fresh and new, even if we're familiar with them. We've read maybe the book of Genesis, but how can we see it differently? That's what this poem is hoping to allow us to do. Milton is hoping to look at old ideas in a fresh way and hoping that in the mind of readers, new ideas emerge. And in my experience, this tends to be the case, and that's why I like to think about how this poem accomplishes this defamiliarization. Let me provide one example. So this is on the handout, quote 3. This is Adam and Eve. If there's a biblical reference point, it would be Genesis 2:23, the flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone poem. Milton is trying to defamiliarize us through elongated poetic discourse. Let's look at it. So this is Adam speaking to Eve. Let me read it. How can I live without thee? How forgo thy sweet converse, and love so dearly joined, to live again in these wild woods forlorn? Should God create another Eve, and I another rib afford, yet loss of thee, whenever from my heart? No, no, I feel the link of nature draw me, flesh of flesh, bone of bone thou art, and from thy state mine shall never be parted. Bliss or woe, however, I with thee have fixed my lot, certain to undergo like doom. If death consort with thee, death is to me as life. So forcible within my heart, I feel the bond of nature draw me to my own in thee, for what thou art is mine. Our state cannot be severed. We are one flesh. To lose thee were to lose myself. So while discussion of Paradise Lost can tend to be sort of dominated by political or theological considerations, this example, I think, shows us how we can contain within this poem is a tender celebration of love. On the one hand, we should start to see a couple things. We should start to see first that Milton's version of paradise is a variation of the biblical narrative. On the other hand, he is hoping to allow us to see the biblical narrative for what it is in a fresh way. In essence, we are seeing this book like this well-known image where there's two faces and a vase in the middle. There are several ways to focus our attention and our appreciation on Milton's poem, like there are to look at this picture from several different angles. So on the one hand, we can read about the war in heaven. It's ugly, it's brutal, it's devastating, there's death, there's sin and disease, on the one hand. On the other hand, we experience life in paradise when we engage Paradise Lost. Milton presents this paradise, just to give some of his descriptions, in a world before the fall, a place with golden fruit and pristine verdant groves, a garden that surrounds a wilderness peak, subterranean rivers which rise as a fountain of living water, and charmed beasts without predation. He evokes dread of the impending fall on one hand, but on the other, he allows us to feel the awe-inspiring omnipotence of providence. He allows us to bask in the wealth of God's love and liberty. We are positioned as readers to understand God, man, and the angels and that interaction, and on the other, just between men and women. We wrestle with God's severe justice on the one hand and his grace and mercy on the other. We look at decay and chaos on the one hand, but hope of redemption to come. We see Satan's lies and God's truth. This happens much through Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost, in summary, is an elegant, penetrating, and challenging examination of human nature. It allows us to see better. It allows us to understand the limits, perhaps, of our own narrow human perspective and to see various angles from God's perspective, from the angel's perspective, or even from the demons. And rhetorically, what Milton does is, just as Adam appeals to Eve, he often has Satan attempt to get readers to accept his rebellious appeal. He rebelled as a virtuous choice, he presents to readers, as one he made of his own free will. Let me give an example of how Satan appeals to readers and tries to persuade them to accept his position. So this is quote number 4 on your handout. In this example, Satan is disguised as a cherub, and he's speaking to an angel by the name of Uriel. And Uriel is supposedly the one guarding earth. So Satan approaches Uriel, again, disguised as another angel. And what I want you to see is that he is, while talking to the angel, also talking to readers and appealing to us to maybe come to his position in ways that are deceptive, sneaky, but yet sophisticated. So here is what Satan says disguised to Uriel. To visit off this new creation round, unspeakable desire to see and know, all these his wondrous works, but chiefly man, his chief delight and favor, him for whom all these his works so wondrous he ordained, hath brought me from the choirs of cherubim, alone thus wandering. Brightest seraph, tell, in which of all these shining orbs hath man his fixed seat, or fixed seat hath none? But all these shining orbs his choice to dwell, that I might find him, and with secret gaze, or open admiration, him behold, on whom the great Creator hath bestowed worlds, and on him hath all these graces powered, that both in him and all things as is meet, the universal Maker, we may praise. So to translate, again, this is Satan speaking disguised physically, and he is praising man, Adam. He is praising humanity, and his speech flawlessly reflects respect for God. You would be hard-pressed to find anything in there that's subterraneanly, dissing God. It convincingly conveys his identity as a worshiper of God, in fact, who successfully, in this case, tricks Uriel. If he can trick Uriel, can he trick readers? That's what Milton is pondering here. Will his rhetoric work on readers, and will the reader fall into this moral trap? This is the moral test that I have subtitled this talk. Satan's talent for fraud demonstrates his ability to deceive even those most on guard against him. So to really get at this fully, we need to look at John Milton as a person, and we'll come back to this rhetoric of Satan. Here is a picture of a young John Milton, age 10. He was born in London in 1608 to a father who worked as a music composer. From a very young age, John believed he was marked for greatness. Most biographies are a mark of his youthful arrogance, and that really fueled his overwhelming ambition. And he was very ambitious, even to the end, I'd say. But he wasn't all talk at this age. He was a studious and voracious reader from a young age. He was tutored by a Scottish Presbyterian who had an MA from St. Andrews. As a young boy, he was tutored with sound intellectuals surrounding him. While at school at St. Paul's in London, John learned Latin, Greek, and Italian. He eventually graduated from Cambridge in 1629 with his BA and his MA in 1632, also from Cambridge. He was preparing at that time to be an Anglican priest. During this time, he tutored a friend in Hebrew in exchange for learning Dutch. He also learned French, Spanish, and Old English. Yeah, I know. And during this time, this was during the plague, a plague in London, not the Great Plague. That came later in his life. Just for context, when he was 3, the King James Version, the authorized version, was published of the Bible. While at Cambridge, John was very much an outsider. It's noted in most biographies. He criticized, for instance, the structure of the curriculum. He wrote a lot about education, but as a student, he brought his complaints to the administrators about how the curriculum was structured. When his friends and peers put on a comedy, a play, he criticized that. And he had trouble fitting in, and there's some research suggesting some hard words thrown at him while as a student. He was an outsider. He published poetry, though, as a student. He published during this time an epigraph to William Shakespeare, who died when John Milton was 8 years old. And some of his poetry was published as a student. After graduating, he spent 6 years in self-directed study to be a poet. Imagine you had 6 years of self-directed study to be a poet. What would you study? Well, he studied ancient and modern works of theology, philosophy, history, politics, literature, and science. Then, after that 6 years, he toured France and Italy for 15 months. There he met, he was around, here's a little older picture. There he met Galileo while in house arrest and had a conversation with him, which has now escaped history. He got a tour by a Vatican librarian of their collection. In Venice, he was greatly influenced by a type of governance called republicanism. He returned to England, though, in the summer of 1639 after 15 months because there was news of a civil war, a second civil war breaking out in England. It's important to note at this point, this is around 1639, he really puts on pause his literary projects for about 20 years. He dedicates his energy, his time, his pen, his mind to defending the state and defending his principles in relation to the church and the state, I should say. He wrote a lot of tracts in favor of Puritan and parliamentary causes. I'll get more into that in a moment. But in 1642, he was 34 years old. At this point, he married a much younger woman, 17-year-old Mary Powell. And it said that their relationship clashed intellectually, maybe for obvious reasons from the very start. They said they never consummated their marriage before they separated for 3 years. And during that separation time, he penned several tracts, 3 of them, on divorce, that divorce should be allowed beyond grounds of adultery, which, remember, 17th century Puritan England, this is pretty wild stuff because he got attacked viciously and vigorously and often. So many harsh attacks came in at him to try to censor him, to stop him putting forth a position like that with divorce, that he ended up penning what was and what is his most respected and most read essay still today, called the Areopagitica. Areopagitica. The long-form title is Areopagitica, a speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. His rally cry in this letter I've pulled out in the slides: give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties. Remember, I said he was the apologist of freedom. This really comes out in this prose tract, but it comes out in the poetry of Paradise Lost as well. That he provides a robust defense of the right for the freedom of speech, and it still provides a cornerstone for a lot of people arguing for the justification of liberty still today. To understand this call for freedom, we need to understand a little bit more about English politics in the 17th century and how John was really involved in that world. So the Second English Civil War took place in 1648. That's when it ended. And what happened was the power shifted to the Parliament and the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth ran from 1649 to 1660. This is the one that Oliver Cromwell was in charge of. John Milton worked for that administration. He used his pen to defend Republican principles as he understood them for the Commonwealth of England and for Cromwell and other Puritans. He was radical, really, in his reforms, though. He argued it vigorously in favor of divorce, education reforms nationally. So he took his Cambridge disputes and brought it to Parliament. He argued for wide religious toleration. He argued for a separation of church and state, the abolition of monarchy, regicide, if necessary, which is, killing the monarch, and a republican government. Those were his main claims to fame during that time. During this time, the state appointed John to the role of the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, which meant he wrote letters in Latin, usually to other nations or in their home language. He was writing foreign correspondences. That's a day before sort of new media. It was handwritten letters. He created writing that was also explicitly a defense of the English people, what we might call propaganda. And he penned a handful of sonnets, one to Oliver Cromwell, who he affectionately calls our chief man. But during this time, John Milton became blind. Slowly but surely, by 1652, Milton became totally blind, probably due to glaucoma, something that we could fix today. He was 43 years old, so just 2 years older than me. He basically, from this point on, dictated all of his prose, all of his letters, despite that he continued to work. He had an amanuensis or sort of someone on board to listen and write for him. Those people that wrote for him were somebodies. For example, he had the poet Andrew Marvell, who wrote To His Coy Mistress, a poem that is still read today. He was basically writing for John Milton. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell died and the English Republic collapsed. During that time, most people sort of changed their position, didn't really defend the republicanism as it had stood during the Commonwealth, but Milton stayed true despite the vigorous attacks. He stayed true to what inspired the revolution. He sort of denounced corrupt practices in church governance. He wrote a treaty at this time attacking the concept of a state-dominated church, which was surely on the rise. And despite the vast unpopularity of his position, he wrote many, many more proposals for a non-monarchical government. In 1662, there was what was called the Stuart Restoration. There's King Charles II. He sat on the throne. Oliver Cromwell had long disappeared. Fearing for his life, Milton went into hiding. Many of his regicide friends who supported that position were themselves killed, hanging, drawing the blood, disemboweling, quartering. It was very vicious. He was imprisoned for a short while, but due to probably influential friends was let go. His books were publicly burned, and over time, though, he was generally pardoned. That was 1660 when the Stuart Restoration happened. 1667 is when Paradise Lost was published. John Milton was 60 years old. He had been working on this epic since 1938, so somewhere in the range of 30 years, he had it in his mind to write, though he did largely pause it for that 20-year span. It went through a lot of conceptualizations. For instance, when he first imagined Paradise Lost, he thought he'd write a national epic that would be based on King Arthur and the Round Table, but he dropped that idea. It didn't seem based in history. So he decided to write a great epic subject for his time, which was about the fall, and not the celebratory founding of a nation like the Aeneid. He wanted to write a different epic poem. The reason is likely because that at this point in his life, he had lost the hope of an enduring city of God on earth. As Milton aged, he spent the remaining decades of his life in London in this cottage that you can see still today. He wrote several minor prose works. This is when the Great Plague of London happened, and he largely stayed in his cottage. And then in 1674, a second edition of Paradise Lost was published, and that's important because it goes from 10 to 12 books. It's largely a restructuring and reorganizing of what was already there. He published a second edition and 4 months later died of what was likely due to complications from gout, another thing that is preventable. But there it is. He died on November 8th, 1674. He was 65 years old. So let's take a look at Paradise Lost in a little more depth here. We'll look at book 1, and I have this on the handout on quote number 5. This is an epic invocation, and these are usually in epics a space for the poet to call upon a deity, a muse, to inspire him or her to compose the poem. On this case, calling out to God or to the Holy Spirit or to Moses is how Milton will frame it. And this happens usually at the beginning, but it can happen in a new section as well. So we'll go ahead and take a closer look at book 1 here. And so this is the opening lines of Paradise Lost. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe. With loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai did inspire that shepherd, who's first taught the chosen seed in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos, or if Zion hill, delight thee more, and Silo's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God. I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that does prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss, and made it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support. That to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. I did mention that he was ambitious, right? So let's start with a couple main points. I've labeled these on the handout, but there are 5 main things that I'll draw to the surface. And when I get done, we will have a Q&A, so hold those thoughts. The first one is this reference to a greater man. This is a reference to God's providence's exaltation of his son, God's son. Milton is drawing on the coronation psalms, such as Psalm 2 and others, and he starts by really exalting the Son of God because as the poem progresses through God's rescue plan, it becomes clear that the very exaltation of the Son provokes anger and jealousy of Satan. Satan's worldview is one of a zero-sum game. If one person receives a reward or a raise or an elevation of any sort, that someone else must have a demotion. He can't understand. It's somewhat mysterious why Satan is so angry at the Son's elevation. They're both, at this time, Satan has not fallen. He is an angel, right? And so he's an angel looking on God's Son, and he's upset that there's an elevation of the Son. And he feels this rage, this upset feeling. Again, somewhat mysterious. It's not very clear why he feels so upset, other than to understand life as a zero-sum game. Then in the invocation here, around line 6, there's a reference to the heavenly muse. He requests thy aid to my adventurous song, to pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, in poetry or prose. The poet is attempting to describe something not given to us in Scripture, we might say. He's writing a sequel to inspired Scripture. And he does this, and he hopes to do this by reference to a shepherd, Moses, who wrote the Torah. Milton makes a bold claim to originality here that is quite provocative. He is a prophetic bard, if you will. And he goes further, and the third point, he is referring to the Spirit, who he describes dove-like, with mighty wings outspread, sitting brooding on the vast abyss, and he made it pregnant. Well, and made it pregnant. It's not he. It's a feminine here. The Spirit is feminine. This is the Spirit that moves on the waters in Genesis. Milton is using Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation of these verses. And in Latin, it's not so much a molding of hands, but a dove-like impregnation on the waters. And this sort of impregnating of the Spirit sort of suggests implicitly that the Holy Spirit is a feminine deity, which would have been either seen as impiety or at least theologically questioned, as it was by his readers at the time. It's quite a sort of scandalous implication. And really kind of an artistic risk. But he's really pulling on Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and oftentimes in the poem, he'll play on double meanings of words. Sometimes a word in Latin will mean something different than it means in English. And so he's kind of doing that already here with the Spirit. So what is fascinating, just to sort of think about the theological, the artistic risk that he's making, and this is really implicit even in the invocation here, but what's important to note is that John Milton wrote a sort of Latin treatise called On Christian Doctrine. And he spells out his beliefs. And in that, he describes himself as a philosophical monist. He was repudiating the sort of Neoplatonic dualism that was popular in the 17th century. So like the so-called proponents of the Arian heresy, before him, Milton argued that the Son is a subordinate deity, which is kind of shocking if you didn't know that about him. He's saying that the Son is not omniscient, not omnipotent, or eternal, but produced by an act of God as a firstborn of all creation. His belief as a monist is that the spirit and matter, or angels and humans, only differ in degrees of refinement from one corporeal substance to the next. Creation for Milton is not out of nothing, but it is out of God. The poem will describe one first matter as a title for God, as the substance of all beings, including the Son. So this would seem to really shock the readers if the reference to the Holy Spirit wouldn't shock them. But actually, what received the most attention, and this is really confounding to modern readers, but what received the most attention is that this poem didn't rhyme. That's right, it's written in blank verse. If you notice, there's no rhyming at the end of lines. He's trying to do something unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. It's unrhymed iambic pentameter. That's da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. I'm trying to read it like that, but my pronunciation in American English is a little different from how he would have spoken, and also how some of these words are written. I'm sort of changing them, if you can't tell by how I'm reading it. He's also, 3/5 of the poem is enjambed, so he'll end a line part way and then pick it up in the next line, and so it doesn't complete the thought. It kind of keeps going to the next line. It keeps going to the next line. That wasn't done in poetry. It was done in plays. And so people were confused about whether this was even a poem. They didn't know what it was. And actually, the second time it was published, the publisher requested and almost required, and he did agree to do it. He wrote a justification for not rhyming in the poem. And in that justification, he writes that he is setting an example of, quote, ancient liberty restored to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. He's very much for freedom and ending that bondage and liberty. He'll ring that bell even with not rhyming. And what's interesting is John Dryden, another well-known author of that time, published an opera in 1677 called The State of Innocence, where he rewrote Paradise Lost with rhymes, so that you could enjoy it for what it should have been. I don't think he actually finished it, but some of it is captured in that opera. It's an opera. So, okay, so back to the text. Point number 4 I have here. What is low, raise, and support? Right? What is in me dark, illumine? What is low, raise, and support? This is a reference to John's own blindness. I mentioned sort of the epic tradition. Sometimes it's outward facing, sometimes it's more psychologically inward. I think this is more of a reflection of his own blindness. It's an image also of the muse dictating to him at night. Later in the poem, he'll say this dictation happens in the dark of night. This is when he comes up with his unpremeditated verse that comes to him. He is trying to come before something that has already happened. Sometimes this is called retrospective anticipation. He is trying to prophesy about something that's already passed, long before the fall even. This is an impossible ambition, but it never stopped John Milton from going after it. And he does attempt this appeal, and he appeals to Moses, right, the shepherd, and he wants to be not like Virgil, not like Homer. He wants to be like Moses. He wants to be like the prophets of the Old Testament. That's who he aspires to be like. The 5th point, the last line that ends so strongly on our ears, that he may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. This is a way of saying that the poet helps to exonerate God. And surely we've all been in situations, maybe something terrible has happened, and someone says to us, why would God do that? And usually our response isn't, let me justify that to you. But that's essentially what Milton is positioning himself as. An apologist, he's writing a theodicy, a defense of God in the face of evil. And this is during the sort of high mark of Calvinism when Milton is writing. And the big question on many people's minds concerns how God could allow the fall if he had pre-knowledge of it all along. How is there justice when God has complete foreknowledge? He says, let me justify the ways of God to you. Scripture tends to resist a straightforward justification on human terms because God's ways are not man's ways. However, Milton's invention is to trace things far back before Adam and Eve to Lucifer's fall, his choice of rebellion, that has some consequences for Adam and Eve. It doesn't necessarily lead to that, but it has influence in when that happens. That's sort of his invention. By magnifying Satan's primordial choice, one question is raised. What deficiency in this angel, Lucifer, predisposed him to feel impaired or bothered by God exalting his son? Why did he feel that way? If there's no reason, then he's capricious. But if there is one, the question of evil's origin becomes an infinite regress. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? More implicit but equally important, if read as a theodicy, that's a defense of God in the face of evil. Milton is hoping that we see the divine response to rebellion as creation. This is extraordinary providence, that there is a fall, but God provides a response in his Son. In short, Milton puts forth the promised incarnation of the Son as more powerful than God's response to the fall in the garden that leads to them going east of Eden. So, Book 1, this is the invocation of Book 1 that we read. But the whole book, if I could just provide a 30,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 foot view of this poem, which is 65,000 words or thereabout. Book 1 is a picture of Satan in hell on a burning lake. He has fallen from heaven. Though Satan is described, he and a bunch of other demons and angels who fought with God are there, and they all lost. And he says, although they've been beaten, Satan gives a good speech to tell them that not all is lost. It's a very convincing speech that he gives on a plain to a bunch of demons. He appeals to the fallen angels to rise up now or be fallen forever. The angels do rise up in response to his moving oratory, his rhetoric. They assemble in squadrons. He says, don't worry. We will rise again. We'll fight God, but we can't fight him the way we did before. We lost. That was too explicit, direct. They have to be more subtle. They have to be more deceitful. They have to put on a public face and have a private motivation through lying, through deception. That's what is basically adopted by Satan and the angels to try to overthrow God by coming to man, to Adam and Eve in the garden to tempt them. That's how they get to God. That's how they're overthrow. That's how they win the second war that they lost the first time in heaven. So let me illustrate his appeal to the angels and to humans alike. This is quote number 6. And what you'll notice is something that a scholar by the name of Stanley Fish, who I've referenced already, a good Miltonian scholar, points out. He sort of says that in heaven, the speech, the rhetoric that shows up is very teaching style. It's oriented towards information, a lot of description. It's very plain and direct. There's no trickery. But the grand style of heaven is very deceptive. And here is one of the most quoted series of lines, I'd say, from Paradise Lost, as it references sort of lines from Satan. And this is quote number 6. and I will read that in its entirety. Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, said then the lost archangel, this the seat, that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equaled, forth hath made supreme, above his equals. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven or hell, a hell or heaven. What matter where if I be still the same, and what I should be all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But wherefore, let we then, our faithful friends, thy associates and co-partners of our loss, lie thus astonished on this oblivious pool, and call them not to share with us their part in this unhappy mansion, or once more, with rallied arms, to try what may be yet regained in heaven, or what more lost in hell. Many readers have come away from these lines thinking that Milton had sympathy for the devil, to quote the Rolling Stones. But before the Stones, there was quite a few commentators that genuinely thought that Milton has warmth and affection for Satan because of lines like these. One of those individuals is William Blake, who wrote between 1757 and 1827. This is on your handout, I believe, as well below that. Blake wrote this. He said that the reason Milton wrote in fetters or chains when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils in hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. So this was not John Milton's intention by any stretch of the imagination, I think, when you really dig into it. But it hasn't stopped people like William Blake and others reading this great sympathy they think that Milton had for the satanic appeal. It also doesn't take away that Milton is trying to explain what Satan's appeal is to the demons and to those who are fallen. Satan is a figure of power in the poem. He has an awesome side. He's proud, he's courageous, he has a regal type of authority, and above all, this sort of magnificent rhetoric that convinces the demons to take this charge forward to have another war in heaven. Satan's moving language of defiance against tyranny and laments for loss are powerfully attractive. He poses readers a difficult challenge of discerning the discrepancies between his noble words and his motives and actions. And there is a discrepancy. What he says is not always what happens, but you have to really perceive that as a reader. He doesn't create a paltry medieval devil with, a little tail and a pitchfork. That's not the Satan he's describing. Rather, he describes him through allusion to other great heroes, such as Achilles, Odysseus, and perhaps most profoundly, Prometheus. He has the usual epic traits of a hero, such as physical prowess, battle courage, battle glory, anger, fortitude, determination, endurance, and leadership. In the end, Milton invites readers to measure all other versions of the heroic embodied in Satan against the sacrificing love of the Son of God. That's what he wants readers to do. But this is why many readers think that Milton is describing Satan with affection. And if that's not enough, the characters never are forcibly thrown out of heaven. They make themselves fall. They don't get pushed off the cliff. God does not push them and the other rebellious angels out of heaven. Rather, they throw themselves. This is how it's described. They throw themselves headlong themselves they threw, down from the verge of heaven. So it's out of their own volition, their will, their choice. They wanted to do this, even though they didn't want to lose, surely, but there is a sense of freedom there. Milton gauges this entanglement of good and evil. And it's up to critical readers to sort of disentangle. One of those critical readers was C.S. Lewis, who I mentioned wrote a preface to Paradise Lost. This is really a series of lectures that's now collected as a book they gave in 1941. He really challenged the popular notion at the time that Milton's Satan was the hero of Paradise Lost. That was sort of what was the assumed norm because of this description of him, like the other heroes before him. Rather, Lewis argues that Satan was not only morally evil, but also supremely egotistical, even showing himself in some ways to be foolish and tedious. Lewis's assertion continued to shape interpretations till today. And let me give an example. So in book 3, what we just read was from book 1. But by book 3, it becomes abundantly clear that Satan does not really believe it's better to be in hell than to be in heaven. He says that, but later that becomes clear that that's really manipulation to get the others to follow him. It's blatant sophistry, intentionally twisting the truth to make his demons want to follow him just far enough. Far from liking hell better than heaven, Satan absolutely hates it in hell. He wants nothing more than get out and wreak his vengeance against God. What's more, he leaves his demons behind in hell while he escapes alone from this lake, this place that's described very much without light. It's a enclosure that's dark and suffocating, unlike the light of heaven in the clouds that he imagines. What kind of true leader would do something like that is what Milton is trying to get us to consider. What kind of leader leaves his legions behind? The fact is that Satan in this poem is a selfish, manipulative politician who will say anything for demons or people to elect him. Milton makes it very clear that Satan is a liar, a cheater, and a scoundrel who will use clever rhetoric and sneaky mind gains to manipulate people. So really at the heart of this poem is this sort of manipulative rhetoric, this public-facing image with his private self, with his actions, often contrasting with his words. The poem suggests that the impulses, passions, and desires, those aren't sinful in themselves, but it's what we do with those sinful actions, whether we act on them or not. That's what makes the difference. So there's also kind of line or two that I want to look at on the handout I gave you, quote 7. This is sort of a rebuttal to Satan from an angel. And I think it helps to just see this firsthand. I'll go through this pretty quickly. So this is a rebuttal to Satan by a faithful angel who is here called Abdiel. So that's that faithful angel. Abdiel rebukes Satan. Consider this. This comes from book 6, so this is much later than what we just read. To whom in brief, thus Abdiel sternly replied. To Satan he says, apostate, still thou errest, nor end wilt find of erring, from the path of truth remote. Unjustly thou depravest it with this name of servitude, to serve whom God ordains, or nature. God and nature bid the same. When he who rules is worthiest and excels them whom he governs, this is servitude. To serve the unwise, or him who hath rebelled against him, is worthier as thine now serve thee. Thyself not free, but to thyself enthralled. Yet lewdly darest our ministering upbraid. Reign thou in hell, thy kingdom. Let me serve in heaven God ever bless, and his divine behest obey, worthiest to be obeyed. Yet chains in hell, not realms expect. Meanwhile, from me returned, as erst thou saidst, from flight, this greeting on thy impious crest receive. So Satan is addressed as an apostate. He is in error. He says he will remain in error. He will be on a path with no truth, with no end of sight of that untruth. He describes Satan here as rebelling not just against God, but against nature. This is natural law philosophy that Milton largely abides by. He's saying you're rebelling not only against God, but against nature here. And he gives this definition really of the ultimate loss of liberty, the ultimate loss of freedom. He says, thyself not free, but to thyself enthralled, to thyself enchained. You're a prisoner to your own passions, to your own self. And if you're not convinced that Milton was writing a satanic apology, consider the second book that is noted called Paradise Regained. I don't know if you've heard that, but basically Milton writes about Christ's temptation by Satan in the desert, and in the poem, Christ resists Satan's temptation, and Satan is left utterly defeated and humiliated in that poem that Milton composed. So I kind of veered from book one, but book one takes place in hell. That's where Satan is sort of in this place of darkness. Book two, just to give you a kind of brief overview, I'm going to finish up here in a moment. Satan will fly to the Garden of Eden, and that's where he'll seduce Adam and Eve into disobedience. Book three, he moves the camera, as it were, to the throne room of God in heaven. And, before Milton, Dante's Inferno, some years before it was published, and he shows heaven. But Dante didn't dare show the throne room of heaven. But Milton goes one step further. He not only shows the throne room of heaven, but he has a conversation he records between God and the Son in heaven, in the throne room that we see in book three. What's important to note is all these places, whether we're talking hell, heaven, or Eden, they change depending on the character's actions in those places. So that includes even heaven, or hell, or the garden. Heaven is a place in process. It requires active choosing to do good. As Raphael will explain to Adam, it will remain heaven as long as their obedience holds. And that's true with all the places Satan or Milton describes. Book four is Eve's love song, as it's often called. The camera moves to Eve. She says that everything good about Eden is found in her partner Adam. At the end of book four, there's a provocative scene where Eve is sitting there, and it describes Satan. It says that he is there, they found squat like a toad, close at the ears of Eve. So there's Eve in the garden, and there's squat like a toad, Satan whispering in her ear. He whispers to her the groundwork for the temptation. Again, like a toad. You have to see that image. He claims that the beautiful fruit is a waste. It's like the moonbeams that are shining bright at night while people are asleep. Why not eat it? He calls her angelic Eve, but she's not an angel. So he flirts with flattery. The scholar Alistair Fowler describes the scene as a serenade, a satanic perversion of a love song. The careful reader will see that Satan has a facade, this public face, what he says to others, and what he actually believes and sees. There's a sharp contrast. Book five moves to the war in heaven, and the creation is narrated to Adam by Raphael. Raphael and Adam have a very wide-ranging conversation, and you'll get lost in that if you've ever tried to read it. It's a very animated conversation. There's a lot of vigorous exchange and dialogue back and forth between Adam and Raphael. This is kind of before the fall, and there's a lot of education going on, a lot of explanation from Raphael to Adam, teaching him. There's an interaction between humans and angels, and this happens in Paradise Lost, I think, for a reason. Usually it's suggesting there's a better way to improve our earthly life, and that's to set it in the context of a sort of heavenly continuation between angels and humans. Book 6, 7, and 8 continues the conversation between Raphael and Adam. Like I said, you can get lost in there. We learn about the details of the war in heaven and creation through these books. Book 9 is the fall. This is a temptation, and this is the fall of Adam and Eve. Book 10 is where sin and death show up in paradise. Adam and Eve face the full weight of knowing good and evil. And after their punishment is pronounced, they acknowledge their sin and repent. Book 11 is when another angel by the name of Michael shows up and has a conversation about future events, essentially, and about a promised Messiah. Whereas the conversation between Raphael and Adam was very animated, this is very solemn and direct and tempered because the fall has happened. He'll instruct them on Israel, the nation, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Messiah. That's sort of what he lays out in Book 11. Book 12, Michael orders Adam and Eve out of paradise. And the last quote I'll read for you is quote 8. These are the very last lines of Paradise Lost. And the context here is Adam and Eve are holding hands as they leave, as they exit east of paradise. Michael leads them out. And there's this moment here after a conversation between really Eve and Michael. And in this conversation, just to kind of summarize, Eve offers to take the full weight of God's wrath on herself in a way that the Son ultimately offers in the throne room, and God accepts that offer. But here, because of their sin, Milton has Eve offer to take that sin upon herself for all of humanity. She's given a remarkable claim to agency and the very last word spoken by a character in the poem. She's a very interesting character. But let's look at quote 8, and this is, again, the last lines. They're getting sort of removed from Eden and by Michael, and this is what we are told by the poet. So spake our mother Eve, and Adam heard, well pleased, but answered not. For now, too nigh the archangel stood, and from the other hill the brandished sword of God before them blazed, fierce as a comet, with which toward heat and vapor, as the Libyan air adust, began to parch that temperate clime, whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by the flaming brand, the gate, with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place to rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. In the end, Adam and Eve are not wandering without hope. Like I said, they have just been told by Michael of the future of humankind and a second Adam. He tells them of the nation of Israel, his chosen people, and finally Christ, who will come to bring redemption. Michael foretells that the kingdom of God will not be established on earth until the Messiah returns for a second time. That will be the city of God. That will be the kingdom. And at that last judgment, he will judge all humankind and reunite heaven and earth. And as a whole, the poem's last lines conjoin this loss of Eden, but also provide a sense of consolation, walking hand in hand. There's a sense of prophecy and providence, and a sense of the challenges they face, but also the comforts they receive along the way. So some say that reading Paradise Lost is something like praying. There's a tension before you begin. You think about how difficult it will be to read this poem, this late Renaissance English poetry, the Latin idioms, the syntax, the ambition to frame the universe in the whole of history and time. You recall that Milton has a near encyclopedic knowledge before you begin. The discourses he uses span the judicial, legal, parliamentary, epistolary. There's prophecy, biblical history, hymns, allegories, sermonizing oratory. His discourses jet in and out of the philosophical and theological treatises that he knew on human nature. Your mind will tell you that there are more productive things to do than read Paradise Lost. Why begin reading this 65,000 word poem? You're never finished, you think. But as one critic put it, let me quote Amelia Griffin, who encourages us to see that Milton offers a journey into the imagination that is full of high drama and entertainment, rich with conflict and dread, With Milton, you plunge into a vast and visual cosmic realm. Much to your surprise, you find spiritual insight there, something that, as a reader, I can agree with. I want to encourage you to take Milton and read some part, or maybe even all of his poem, so that you can understand how his Protestant vision is grounded in his belief in the freedom of the will given to us by a loving God. The freedom is given to us despite God's foreknowledge that we will abuse it. Milton presents readers with the possibility and the challenge to imagine the earth like the new world of Eden. Will it become a potential satellite of heaven or a potential satellite of hell? Milton had a depth of spirit that is evidenced by his understanding of human frailty, suffering, temptation, and the mysteries of God. And just as we grapple with life's difficulties, reading Paradise Lost reminds us of what creates for a rich and a rewarding experience. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening, and let's do some questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.